Right, hello, hello. This would be a great day to be in psychology class because we're going to discuss some of the readings I've been assigning. And obviously, that works a lot better when you're there to discuss them with me and with the fellow classmates. But we'll have to do our best. Um, so let's take a look at a few of these readings. So we'll start with John Garcia's Conditioned Taste Aversion. We're also going to look at that article I put up on positive reinforcement, and then the article Cost of Rewards. Those are the three we'll be looking at in this video session. So conditioned taste aversion, this was a great study. And so it came out, it says here, in the 1960s. And the idea at that time was, based on Pavlov's experience, which was in order to get the dog to pair the bell ringing with salivating, they had to first pair the bell ringing with the meat numerous times, and one right after the other. And so that was the idea. Classical conditioning takes lots of pairings over a considerable amount of time to be effective as a way of learning. So here John Garcia challenges this using only one pairing, specifically looking at nausea and what we call taste aversion. So it says, while working with radiology, he noticed that nausea in humans and nausea in rats, right, from radiation. And after the rats got sick, they began rejecting their food. And so this led him to an experiment where he purposely exposed rats to radiation. I know what you're thinking, is this ethical? Just remember, they're rats. And so then it says 3 days later, he offers this saccharin solution. So let me back up a sec. So after the irradiation, this is a half hour, the rats that were made sick, some of them were given saccharin, something that they really like, this sweet, tasty drink. And other rats who were made sick were not given the saccharin. Then 3 days later, he offered them saccharin again. And the rats who were made sick and had the saccharin now refused it, or didn't have very much at all. Whereas the rats who had been made sick but didn't get the saccharin drank quite a bit. And so he said, okay, after just one pairing, he showed this, what he called conditioned aversion. And then this, it says right here, this finding encountered vigorous protest. So it went against everything that people had thought about classical conditioning. And so they basically doubted him and his work. So he had to replicate it and to become established in this idea of taste aversion. So as a typical reaction was that of a professor who, hearing of Garcia's finding, said to him, "Young man, that is completely impossible. That is completely impossible." So he had to persevere through the rejection of all of his peers. So then they had other questions, and they said, is it the aftertaste? Is it arbitrary? And so he came up with a second experiment to further illustrate the specifics of taste aversion. So rats were exposed to bright, noisy water. Rats were exposed to sweet water. There was a shocking part. There was a nausea part. And what he discovered, you can obviously, you've read through this, is that's the combination that counts. Rats are pretty good at making a connection between taste and nausea, but they don't make a very good connection between light and sound and nausea, the bright, noisy water. So, and with shock, the opposite is true. And then another study, not done by Garcia, but related, was of these children who rejected a new ice cream because they'd been exposed to radiation. And so there's taste aversion there as well. So I highlighted some things down here as far as looking at conclusions. The ability to learn certain things can itself be instinctive, and there seems to be an instinctive readiness to learn certain things. So, and then down here, obviously it's very useful for humans and animals to avoid eating certain things if it's poisonous or makes us, we have this this barrier, into a blood barrier into our brain, to try to prevent toxins getting into our brain. One of the instincts there is to throw up, to get rid of whatever toxin is in our stomach. And so this is the way God created us. And so he's speaking from an evolutionary perspective, which we of course completely reject. So he also points out a difference in birds. Birds like quail, for example, choose their food based on vision, not on taste. So a quail will quickly learn to avoid food with a color if they get sick, but not a taste, because quail choose their food on vision and not taste, which is kind of bizarre. Maybe you never heard of that before. So the big takeaway here is, one, the behaviorists believe that we're basically a blank slate. So he quotes John Locke here, who was a philosopher. Maybe you know him from like 2 treatises on government, because some of his ideas informed the writing of the Constitution in our founding documents. And so the behaviorist believes like we're a complete blank slate, and our environments write upon our blank slate and teach us. So it's all like we avoid pain and seek pleasure. Well, here we have a rejection of that. We have evidence to show that humans clearly are prepared to learn things more quickly than they are to learn other things. And they see that in the case of the rats as well. So in other words, God made us very well, right? He didn't make us as a blank slate. He made us with instincts and ability to learn things to help us survive and prosper. And Garcia's experiment shows us that we have a preparedness to learn certain things. So if you have questions on that article, feel free to shoot them my way. I'm going to switch to a second article here. This is the one on teacher to parent positive reinforcement doesn't work in the long run. So the question is about a 3rd grader who came home in tears because he was punished for talking during silent reading time. The teacher kept him in recess to do his reading. The parent obviously objected to this, saying it was destroying a child's love for school. And he says, what about you? He or she, parent, says, what about using positive reinforcement? Obviously, this man was not very sympathetic to this parent. And his argument was that positive reinforcement doesn't work in the long run. And once that positive reinforcement's gone, then the behavior often stops. And also, high schoolers are very, very difficult to persuade with positive reinforcement. He's not saying that complimenting and encouraging students doesn't have its place. He's saying that if we're trying to manipulate student behavior by giving rewards, that's going to come up in failure, because eventually, as he mentions here, like what we're motivated by changes. So our peers have such a heavy influence on us in high school. We care so much what they think that we often will, there's no more powerful reward that a teacher can give that's going to overpower the desire of a guy to talk to the girl he likes in history or psychology, or throwing something at the back of your friend's head, or whatever it is that you do that might be characterized as misbehavior. His point is, if you have to reward a student for reading, as soon as those rewards dry up, the kids' reading will dry up in many cases. And so he's advocating a more real world approach. And so he had this story here about this old man annoyed by teenagers who walked home every day by cutting through his yard and stomping on his grass. They ignored his yelling, so he tried to use positive reinforcement reverse. So he pays the kid $1 for every time they walk across his lawn. And the kids, of course, were doing this anyway, so they're like, great, this old man's lost his mind. He's paying us to walk across his yard. When he used to yell at us, and now he pays us. Then one day he stopped paying them and said, forget it, I'm not paying you anymore. So the kids became so disgusted they refused to walk on his lawn ever again. So he won when other means were not working. And this is, he uses this, the author uses this as an example. What happens when rewards dry up? We often drop the behavior because we no longer have the reward. And he said, so in elementary school, maybe rewards work a bit with kids, but as life progresses, there needs to be real world solutions. And so he says, schools shouldn't prepare a kid for a world that doesn't exist. In real life, citizens aren't rewarded extrinsically for being good citizens. You don't get a bonus check for paying your taxes on time. Cops don't pull you over and hand you $50 for going the speed limit. No one throws you a pizza party for not firebombing your neighbors. And his main point here is virtue should be its own reward. And that's kind of his concluding argument. We should be moral, he says, because it's the right thing to do, but we have a higher authority, right? We should honor God, and that should motivate us. The reason we should work hard at school isn't to get good grades or because our parents reward us for good grades, if that's the case, or whatever. The reason we should work hard at school is because God commands us to work hard at school. That should be the primary motivation, to do as to God. So I highlighted this part at the end. So if it were my child who came home crying that he hated school because he lost recess for talking during reading time, I'd firmly inform him that tomorrow he should stop talking and read. If he hates school because they took away his recess, he better get ready to hate home too. Because if he disobeys the teacher again, there will be consequences here as well. And that's important too, because you need the parent and the teacher to be on the same page as far as your philosophy here. If the child can go home and complain to his parent about missing recess, and the parent is very on the child's side and doesn't respect the teacher, and the child knows that, then that becomes so much worse for all parties involved. Okay, then the third article, which is related quite a bit, the cost of reward. All right, so quote from Mark Twain that obviously legitimizes the whole article, if you like Mark Twain. Work consists of what a body is obliged to do, whereas play consists of what a body is not obliged to do. So the scenario here, I kind of did some highlighting. We got some preschoolers who have access to color. Some children were told they would receive a reward for drawing with markers. A second group were not given rewards or any external incentive for using the markers. And a third group was not told in advance they would get a reward, but they got one anyway when the session was over. A couple of weeks later, the drawing materials were again made available, and they observed two things. One, how much time the children spent drawing. Secondly, how good the drawings were. And in this note, they said here, this is a blind study. The people who were doing the judging didn't know which children, which group they had been in. So that's important. So there was no favoritism here for the results. The researchers themselves weren't the ones doing the judging. So the children who had expected and received the rewards for their drawings spent about 8% of their time, and their drawings weren't as good. The other two groups spent double the amount of time using the drawing materials, and their drawings were judged as being better. So the conclusion of the study was, it seems that for the children who had been rewarded for their play, drawing with magic markers was not play anymore. And so they talk about they were drawing only to obtain reward, and this over justification effect, which says I'm drawing for fun, sorry, I'm drawing for reward, and I'm also drawing for fun. That seems, there's too much reason to draw there. So it's just like, I'm really just drawing because I'm getting rewarded, where the other people obviously were drawing, the other kids were drawing for fun. So he talks about the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. A conclusion here, suppose that one must eventually turn the behavior over to other more natural but less powerful reinforcement consequences. The danger is that we may then leave the behavior weaker than it would have been if the powerful reinforcers had never been applied. So his argument here is reinforcement did work. The kids who were reinforced for drawing initially did draw and drew well and seemed to enjoy it. So reinforcements did work. It's just that after those reinforcements are removed, kind of like the last article, then children become averse to doing what they had done before. And so we have a couple of examples of why this could be an issue. One he mentions is obvious, like if the whole school system with grades, we give out grades, kids chase grades, that's called an extrinsic reward that's outside the person. And the question is, and educators have debated this long and hard, does this negate the intrinsic reward of learning? So does your love of learning, is it tainted by grades in school? And maybe it is. In my own educational experience, I know that even though obviously I love to learn, that's part of the reason I'm a teacher, right? Because I get the opportunity to, I'm always learning new things. I'm reading new things. I'm reading different books. I love learning. But I do know that, like, for example, even though I love learning about like World War II, for example, what I'm teaching U.S. history right now. I took a class on fascism, and I had a pretty difficult professor. And because he pushed me, I learned a lot more in his class than if I had just been given the resources and said, hey, you should learn more about fascism for teaching U.S. history. So I'm a motivated learner, but being in a class with a structure, with a professor or a teacher who knows what they're doing, and yeah, grades are a part of that too, but it does motivate me to learn more. But it might not motivate you to learn more. But it's just a question to ponder. And our whole educational system, like right now with the advent of Power School, like when I went to high school, we didn't even know what our grade was most of the time because it was in the teacher's grade book, which was not on a computer. And we would get a progress report halfway into the marking period. And then at the end of the marking period, we got our grade. And that's all we knew of what our grade was for the most part. And now it's like, you can check your grade all the time. It might not be up to date, sorry. However, you can check it all the time, and that's kind of made it grades even more of an extrinsic reward reinforcer than they should be, in my opinion. Because we've lost, a lot of times kids aren't saying about a class, oh, I don't like that class because I didn't learn enough. They might say, I didn't like that class because it's too hard and I didn't get the grade I wanted. Grade, 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 instead of what am I learning? What am I learning? What am I learning? As a teacher, your grade, I understand it's important because of scholarships and such, but I'm much more concerned about what are you learning? All right, another thing it has here is foods. If you have a child who doesn't like a food and you say, oh, I will give you ice cream if you eat your vegetables, well, then you're setting the kid up to say, well, this stuff must be pretty awful if I'm being bribed with ice cream just to eat it. So that's not a good use of reward. So you have to be really cautious. Rewards work, but when you stop rewarding, the behavior often ceases. So how can we have to use rewards cautiously. Okay, so And this one is talking about a boy who returns a wallet, and just saying that the boy, gave the wallet back that had $600 in it. Oh, sorry, an envelope that had $600 in it, and the people at the school were like, "Oh, he gave the wallet back. We should," and they gave him a $150 savings bond. And this adult is saying that's messed up because the kid did the right thing. Obviously, you should return money that's not yours. So the doing the right thing has now become not enough for us to behave in the right way. And so we've taken away this intrinsic motivation. The expectation is, if I do the right thing, I should get rewarded. Very similar to the last article, right? But that's not real life. You should, the past author said we should do what's right. Virtue is its own reward. And I said you should be doing things as to God without expecting a reward. And that's the same argument here. A couple more points. Extrinsic rewards do not necessarily subvert intrinsic motivation. Professional singer can still enjoy singing. So relating it back to me personally again, just because I'm paid to be a teacher, I don't work as a teacher primarily for the money. And it's quite clear from the Bible that God expects of you to use your gifts and talents for his honor and glory, and that you should be looking for a vocation where you can honor and serve God with the gifts and talents he's given you. In my case, I feel called to be a teacher. It's not about money. So it's not an extrinsic thing. It's a sense of reasonable service to God, as Romans 12 says. So I can still love learning without, that's an intrinsic part, but it's not based on extrinsic reward. And as a student, you can love learning and you can love to learn new things, and it could be not about the grade. Hopefully that's the case. It also says, if a reward provides information about how well the task is done, rather than providing a reason for doing it, then intrinsic motivation may not suffer. So that's how the grade situation, right? You get a grade for how well you do something. Hopefully it's not the only reason you're doing it. So then intrinsic motivation might not suffer. So that's a good caveat in the conclusion here. And then it says, finally, if intrinsic motivation is not strong to begin with, so it says, so that there's nothing to undermine, reinforcement procedures may carry less risk. So if someone absolutely has no intrinsic motivation at all for doing something, then you can't really wreck motivation that doesn't exist. So in that case, you're going to have to come up with ways to motivate, and you're probably not hurting much there in that case. Okay, so there's 3 articles I've asked you to read and my explanation. Hopefully you didn't find it too cumbersome. If you have questions, go ahead and email me. And if I need to explain something better, I'm more than happy to do that. So that is all for today.